Okay, sir. All set. I am giving you a countdown. 3, 2, 1. We are live.
A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to our fourth consecutive faculty talk on this platform of Department of Urology, SMS Medical College, Jaipur. So, we know that our department, SMS Medical College, started in the year 1976, and we are soon going to complete 50 years in the year 2025. We are proud to have one of the largest departments in the country. We have 13 faculty members in the department with around 27 residents at present, 10 residents per year. So welcome everybody, all our residents, or all our faculty members, all other viewers, those who might have joined throughout the country and abroad maybe. And we welcome our guest faculty today, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, and our honored guest today, Dr. Peter Black. So I would start with sharing my screen. We would with Saraswati Vandana.
सरस्वती नमस्तुभ्यं वरदे कामरूपिणी विद्यारम्भं करिष्यामि सिद्धिर्भवतु मे सदा.
Thank you. I welcome you once again. And our today's faculty who is going to speak on how to write a paper is none other than Dr. Rajiv Kumar. Dr. Rajiv Kumar is Professor of Urology and Associate Dean in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. He is also the editor of our prestigious journal, Indian Journal of Urology. He is scientific co-chair of SIU, scientific chair of Urological Association of Asia, and is also the associate editor in National Medical Journal of India, international consulting editor in Journal of Urology, associate editor in International Journal of Urology. He has more than 250 peer-reviewed publications with him. Today, we also have with us one honored guest, and Peter Black. Peter Black is a urologic oncologist at Vancouver General Hospital. He is a research scientist at Vancouver Prostate Center and professor in the Department of Urological Sciences at the University of British Columbia. He has a clinical subspecialty interest in bladder and prostate cancer and a research program dedicated to urothelial carcinoma. He previously acted as associate editor for European Urology Focus, assistant editor for Urologic Oncology, and associate editor for World Journal of Urology. And at present, he is the inaugural editor-in-chief of SIU Journal. So welcome, Peter Black, and welcome, Rajiv Kumar. So I will hand over to Rajiv Kumar. Kindly start with your presentation.
Thank you, Shivam. Can I get the share screen? Okay, I have it now. Okay. Is my screen now visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Shivam, for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here and do this talk. Thank you also to Peter for very graciously agreeing to be up early in the morning to give us his insightful comments on the topic. As Shivam introduced Peter as the editor of the new SIU journal, and he has extensive experience in editing. So it's a privilege to have Peter as well on this platform. I know we have about 55 minutes, but I don't want to take all of that time up in a presentation. I would rather we have a discussion and address questions rather than my giving a didactic talk for 50 minutes. So I'm going to cover the basics of writing an article in about 30 to 35 minutes. I'm hoping I can keep it down to that. So that then we could have about 15 minutes or so for an interactive discussion and answer questions. Just don't ask me why did I reject your manuscript. I don't have the answer to that very question. So when you talk about writing a scientific article, when you are an author, this is what the world looks like to you. You've probably done some good deal of research. You've put in probably a year or 2 years. If you're a resident, you've put together a thesis and you've now written an article and you want to get it published. But every time you submit that article to a journal, the journal sends it back, sometimes even within 6 hours, and saying, I'm sorry, we don't want your article. And so it appears that there is this bunch of 8 or 10 different people who are called editors or reviewers who seem to have only one job, and that is to prevent you from publishing your article. Therefore, the question obviously is why? Why are they preventing me from publishing my article? I've done research, I've written up a paper. It probably costs nothing to publish today because everything is online. There is virtually no cost for a space. Therefore, why are they stopping me from publishing? Why is it so difficult to publish an article? And therefore, over the next 30 minutes or so, my principal objective would be to give you the inside story. I'd answer it in two parts. One, why is it difficult to publish? And two, what can you do to improve your chances of publishing? So we'll try and break it up into these two parts over the next half an hour or so. So let's first look at why is it so difficult today to publish? Why do journals have rejection rates of greater than 90%, including the Indian Journal, where our rejection rates for original articles today are 90% or higher? So let's go back to thinking about why are you actually writing? Why do you want your article published? The concept of publishing is not new. It began more than 300 years ago, and the article that I'm showing you that I've shown you here, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, was one of the first journals that was published. It is still published even today. But when people began publishing, this concept of publishing came up from the concept of writing to benefit people. You wrote because you had a new scientific discovery. Somebody discovered penicillin, somebody discovered ether, somebody discovered a surgical procedure. And the only way they could tell other practitioners of their discovery was through writing. There was no internet, there was no telephone, and therefore the only way of communicating was through the written word. And instead of writing letters to everybody else, the simplest way of disseminating this information was through putting it in a compendium or a journal. That was the beginning of writing an article. You needed to benefit mankind through your discoveries and you wanted to disseminate that information. And therefore, publishing became an important aspect of dissemination of information to benefit people. But over the years, this has changed. And obviously, there are millions of articles that are written every year today, and they clearly cannot be a million discoveries of penicillin. The changes or the incremental value that is being brought by every published article is so tiny today, on most cases, that the value increment provided by an article is questioned. Therefore, most people today write because they need to get an academic progression. They want to move from an assistant professor to an associate professor and they need a certain number of publications. Then you need publications in order to stand out among your peers. There are thousands of urologists in India today. There are about 4,000 plus urologists in India today. How many get invited to make a presentation? How many get invitations to speak at a conference? How many get recognition among their peers? One of the most important criteria always is publication. It also translates into how many patients you get. Unfortunately, we are not yet that advanced as society, but if you move into more knowledgeable societies, your patients will look you up through your publications and come to you through your publications. Therefore, you need those publications to announce your existence. And third, of course, is money. There is money in publications. Publications is what drives practice. And over the last 1 year in the COVID pandemic, we've seen the entire cycle of publication and how one paper on hydroxychloroquine will sell millions worth of hydroxychloroquine. Two papers on remdesivir make it the absolute godsend. Although the data may be negligible, but will make billions for the company. Therefore, the impetus behind publications have changed. And we are now publishing more because we benefit ourselves with very doubtful benefit that's accruing to the public at large. And therefore, the result is that you get a large number of what are called pseudo publications. You want to publish, you've done research, you have an article that needs to be published. The so called good journals don't want to publish you. And therefore, you have this supply demand mismatch, which is then filled by a large number of pseudo journals or so called journals, which say, we are happy to publish you. Just give me some money and I will put your article up on the net. And therefore, the question is, why not? It serves everybody's purpose. I have some research, I have an article, I want to put it up as a publication. These journals exist, they have certain amount of expenses involved because they need to hire a website, and of course they want to make money. That is the driving factor. Let me pay them 2,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees, it's not a big deal. And my article is published, they're happy, they've got the money, I'm happy, I've got my publication. Therefore, why not? What is the harm in publishing in this manner? And that's what brings us to the most important aspect. And again, actually takes us back to that cycle when I talked about of why do we ever publish? And that is the power of a paper. In medical science, and often in most other science today, we trust what's written on a paper, on a published article, and we use that information to treat patients. Therefore, if what's published in an article is either not true or not really valid or poorly done, it has immense potential to harm people. Very rarely is the data actually verified. I mean, I cannot recall more than one article in 5 years where we've actually asked for raw data, maybe 1 in 2 years where we've asked for raw data from the authors to verify that the data is actually genuine. You simply trust what the authors are saying. And therefore, based on that publication, and we've already talked about remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine primarily because they are very fresh in our minds, what we write on that paper influences practice, and punishments are very rare. I'll show you some examples of punishments. We're all aware of them, but they're so far and few that even a single episode of punishment becomes a big news, which also means that the large majority, even though they may not have dependable data, don't actually get punished. That is the power of a paper, and therefore having some degree of evaluation and scrutiny is critical before a paper is allowed to get published. Now, a counter argument often is made is, why should just these reviewers and editors decide what is good and bad? Why are they sitting on judgment? Why are they being censors in preventing manuscripts from being published? And the answer to that lies in the fact that most of us, as everyday practitioners, really don't have either the knowledge or the time to understand the intricacies of a written paper. For example, we are urologists, but if somebody was to give me a paper on, let's say again, remdesivir, I would probably just look at the journal. Okay, New England Journal of Medicine sounds good. Data coming out of Johns Hopkins sounds good. The introduction says remdesivir for severe COVID. Conclusion says it helps. That's about all I will understand. Very few of us would actually have either the knowledge or the time to do a critical analysis for ourselves as to whether that paper actually is worthy evidence. The New England Journal will sell it to us. I'm not saying that they're bad. 99% of the time, they probably are good. But what the point I'm trying to make is, most of us as daily practitioners don't have the time or the knowledge to be able to assess the true value of a paper. That is why, and since we understand that papers influence practice and harm people, there is this bunch of people called reviewers or editors whose job it is to at least make some assessment of the validity of that paper before it's allowed to go in for public consumption. And agreed, it's immensely flawed. There are enough examples of how flawed this concept of peer review is. but nonetheless, it's the best that we currently have until somebody comes up with a process or a mechanism which is better than what we've talked about. It's the only thing we have, and therefore it's better than having nothing. Now, over the next part of this talk, I will focus on the core element that Shivam had asked me to cover, and that is about how to write a paper. And so, if we've understood why we need to put a good paper together, that's what this first 5-7 minutes were. The next part of the talk will be, therefore, what can I do to make my paper better and be acceptable to the journal? And therefore, we'll talk about what is the structure of a paper. We'll then talk a little bit about individual components that make up the paper, a little bit about how to submit your article, and again, very briefly about misconduct. This talk is not about misconduct, and therefore the discussion on misconduct would be relatively short. So the first thing, when should you start writing a paper? The most obvious answer is you should start writing a paper when you have something to say. There must be some question or some unmet need that you are trying to address. If all that you are doing is saying, we operated on 100 patients, these are the outcomes of those 100 patients, what you are trying to present is actually an audit. An audit is something you do to evaluate your outcomes or your processes without actually trying to answer a specific question. Audits, on the other hand, don't have a very high value on the publication chain unless they find something remarkably new. If all you're telling me is I did 100 laparoscopic nephrectomies and these are my outcomes, my immediate question would be, so what? What are you trying to tell me that's not already known? Therefore, simply compiling data, even if it's for 1,000 subjects, may actually have no value unless you have a research question. That data is useful. I'm not saying the data is not useful. I'm saying that your use of the data and your presentation of the data may not be useful. If, on the other hand, you defined a question, right? I've done 100 laparoscopic nephrectomies. Let me assess how many of them were done by residents and what was their operating time versus how many nephrectomies it took for a resident to achieve the same competence level that a consultant did. Now you have a question. Now the question may be old, it may already have been answered, but at least it's a beginning. You've at least started with the research question that you're trying to answer through the data that you have, and that's the beginning. So don't gather data just for the heck of gathering it. Gather it, but then when you analyze it, always do it with the research question in mind. That's the first essential point before you start writing a paper. You must have something to say. The question that you put must, of course, be scientifically valid. Don't ask a question which is of no relevance either to your practice or to the patient populations that you're talking about. And ask a question which actually is of importance and is science and makes sense. That is a scientifically valid question. So that's the first part. So before you write, you must have something that you wish to write about. The next part is when you do have something to write, you must write it well. You must say it well. So that's the two parts. Having the content first and then presenting it in the proper manner. Both must be fulfilled for an article to be considered worthy. Once you believe you have the content, now let's talk about saying it well. Saying it well, or basically writing it well, you need to adhere to certain basic facts. The first thing is be brief. Now, I cannot emphasize this point enough, particularly because we in India, I believe it's an Indian trait, I suffer from the same trait, tend to say 10 words where 2 words would suffice. Whenever we can use 2 simple words to say something, we would pick up a dictionary and find 4 complex verbs to say the same thing. And sometimes we ourselves won't understand what exactly we have written. Unfortunately, that doesn't impress people anymore. There was a time when English was a sacred language. Very few people could speak it, and therefore speaking it in a more difficult manner made you sound intelligent. It doesn't work anymore. Saying it simply, saying it briefly so that the majority of people can understand it without using Google to translate is more likely to get you understood. So keep it short, keep it brief. Make sure it's complete. Don't hide data. Don't assume that because I have data for 100 patients on 10 different variables, I will now publish 3 papers with 3 variables each. That again turns off people apart from being ethically dubious. That's called actually salami slicing. There's a word for it. But more importantly, what it says is you're not giving us a full picture about your subject, either because you don't have it, or because you don't realize its importance, or because you're keeping it for a third paper. In any of these circumstances, it doesn't make sense. So give us the complete information that is essential for us to interpret what you're trying to say about your subject. I've talked about easy to understand, that is extremely crucial. If you needed a dictionary to understand the word that you're writing, your reader also needs a dictionary. Your reader has exactly the same IQ that you have and has exactly the same knowledge and skills as you have. And therefore, don't make it difficult for him if it was difficult for you. And then, of course, lastly, no misconduct. Now, I said I will not talk much about misconduct, so I will keep it very brief at the end. But if misconduct is picked up on your paper is dead, at least for that journal until you correct it for another journal. And if your misconduct was really bad, the next 3 papers are also dead for that journal because they're just not interested in working with you. So don't indulge in misconduct. It's the first simplest way for a journal to reject you. They will not even look at your paper beyond that, no matter how good your science was. If there is misconduct on that paper, the paper is out immediately. Once you've satisfied yourself that I have something to say and I will stick to the golden rules, now you need to understand how you devise the structure of your paper. The structure of a paper is very beautifully defined in what we call the Bradford Hill questions. Sir Austin Bradford Hill was somebody who not only made these questions, but also gave us the association between smoking and lung cancer. The structure of a paper, and this is all papers, whether it's letter to the editor, case report, review articles, original articles, all follow the same structure. It's called IMRAD. I stands for introduction, M for methods, R for results, and D for discussion. And each one of these segments answers a distinct question. The first question is, why did you even start? Why are you doing this report? Why are you writing? And that comes back to my first question. Why are you writing? Therefore, that's the first part which explains why does this paper need to be written? Why does this study need to be done? The second part describes how you went about conducting your study. The third part gives the actual data that you've gathered without any embellishments. It's just the data. The last part puts your data into context of current knowledge and current practice, and therefore tells people that what is the meaning of what I found. Now, remember, when I say that this applies to every format of article, I truly mean that. You would say that I don't have to make these subheadings in a case report. I don't have to make these subheadings in a letter. So how can it apply to a letter? The fact is, it does apply to a letter. Let me give you an example. Let's say you read an article that said complications of laparoscopic nephrectomy are 10% when done by consultants. Now, you may believe that this data is not what you have found, or you believe the data should be 25% or should be interpreted. So you will write to the editor saying that we read this article, we found it said it was 10%. In our experience, the data shows 25%. We believe that we found that this was 25% in our institution. We found that this was because our consultants are more varied. There are 6 consultants in a general department, whereas you have taken data for only 1 consultant. Therefore, we feel that this 10% cannot be generalized. Now, this would be a letter to the editor. But I will now break it down into how the IMRADs came in. Why did you write the letter? We read an article which said the complication rate is 10%, which is not what our experience is. Therefore, we are writing to you. That's introduction. Methods. We have looked at our data over the last 3 months, and we believe that among our 6 surgeons, the complication rate was different. That was the methods. We've looked at our data. Results. We found that this data we found the number to be 25%. So the result is very straightforward, one line, but that's the result. Discussion. We believe that there is a difference in these two pieces of information because you've reported it for one surgeon who's experienced, whereas ours is a department where 6 people do it, and therefore the complication rate is high. Now, in an 8-line letter, you've got IMRAD. And when you look at it scientifically, every scientific communication actually follows the IMRAD structure. Now, let's delve a little bit into each of these segments. So, introduction introduces the problem that you're talking about. And to make it simple, I would normally break it down into 3 questions that you need to answer when you're writing the introduction. The first thing is, what do we know about the problem that you're talking about? Second is, what do we not know about the problem that you're talking about? And the third part is, what is your research going to tell you about the problem? So again, I'll take the example. Let's stick with nephrectomy and complications because I've picked that up for today. So what is the extent of the problem? You would say nephrectomy is a very commonly performed procedure in urological surgeries. It is often performed by residents or in their second year, and laparoscopy has become the standard. So that is the known problem, that laparoscopy, that nephrectomy is common and laparoscopically is done is a common procedure of doing it. Known knowledge. Unknown knowledge, we don't know what are the complications among the younger urologists or those who have recently gone into practice. It would be important to know this so that they can counsel their patients appropriately and they don't have to resort to literature data from experienced surgeons. So that is the unknown knowledge. We know laparoscopy is common, we know nephrectomies are common. What we don't know are the complication rates among surgeons who have recently gone into practice. Therefore, we conducted an audit or a survey or an evaluation or a prospective study to look at our complications done by surgeons who had recently gone into practice. So that's what you're going to do about it. So you've covered all 3 aspects. That's a good introduction. The introduction typically is short, shouldn't make up more than 10 to 15% of your total length of your paper. So if you're writing a 2000 word article, your introduction should rarely be more than 200 words or 250 words. It's typically written in present tense. We know laparoscopy is common. We know the complications exist. We know that we don't know what the complication rates are. Present tense. Don't stuff it up with references. Only the most essential references to highlight your points should go in the introduction. Not more than 20% of all your references should go in the introduction, probably even fewer than that. If you've previously worked on the same subject, it may be useful to put that up in the introduction. We've previously looked at complications among experienced surgeons. We now wanted to look at complications among junior surgeons. So if you're linking it to a previous work that you've done, you can quote your previous work. If there is overlap of data, it also makes it clear upfront to the readers that some of my data may have previously been presented. And also talk about your study design if it's relevant. So for example, if you're saying, therefore, we conducted a randomized trial to assess it, say you've done the randomized trial, we conducted a prospective cohort study, put that in. So that's the study design, which can be mentioned as the last line of the introduction. So that's how an introduction should be structured. And again, an example of how a good introduction is written is what I call the first and the last line concept, which means that if you read the first line and the last line, you would generally know what the paper is about. So this is the famous pivot study. And if I read just the first 2 and the last line, the treatment of early stage prostate cancer is controversial. Known knowledge, prostate cancer, treatment controversial, especially for tumors detected by PSA screening. Therefore, the unknown knowledge is we don't know how they should be treated. What are we going to do about it? We conducted a randomized trial to assess radical prostatectomy versus observation. So all 3 aspects, known knowledge, unknown knowledge, and what am I going to do about it, are covered on those 3 lines. And even a layman reading these 2 lines would probably be able to understand to a large extent what this paper talks about. And that's how a beautiful introduction could be written. And again, one of my favorite examples is the article on DNA by Watson and Crick in Nature, 1953. This article was barely 2 pages long in Nature, and the introduction is just 2 sentences, but all 3 aspects are covered. Known knowledge, DNA. Unknown knowledge, structure of the salt. What are we doing about it? We're describing the structure of the salt. So all 3 aspects of that introduction are covered just in 2 sentences. Then we talk about the method section. And for editors and reviewers, this is where the crux lies. Unfortunately, this is the part which is least read by readers. Most of them would skip over the methods and look at only the introduction and the conclusion. For a reviewer and editor, the bulk or the meat of your paper lies in the methods. If you've done your study in a manner in which it can't answer your research question, no matter how much data you give me, your paper is not valid. It's the most important part of the paper. It's also where we find the fatal flaw, which means the study is dead. Let's say you're looking at complications of laparoscopic radical nephrectomy. You want to report that. You said most patients were discharged on post-operative day 2, and we are reporting the clave and window complication of the first 30 days. Excellent. How do you know what happened on day 3, day 4? If you haven't described to me that I made phone calls to that patient on the day 7 or on day 30, or all patients were followed up on day 8 or day 30 with a phone call, and you are simply waiting for patients to self-report complications over the next 10 days or 20 days after you've discharged him on second day, to me, that's a weak methodology. And therefore, if you haven't described to me how you assessed your outcomes in the methodology section, that's where your paper dies. If, on the other hand, you described to me that the patients were discharged on day 2, but then we made phone calls on day 7, or we made an assessment on day 30, or the patients were called back, or we made some proactive method to gather data for this study, then I would know that you have the methods to assess the clave and window complications over the first 30 days. If you didn't do that, if that's not on your methods, your paper is probably not worth what you're writing about. So it's the most important part of your paper. The best thing is that this is already written when you've submitted your paper for an ethics committee approval. So although the methods is the meat, the easiest part is it's already written when you start writing a paper. When you drafted your protocol, when you submitted it for an ethics approval, you would have written the methods. There is nothing that you can change after you've submitted it for an ethics approval and the ethics committee has given you an approval for a particular method. That's exactly what you should have done, and that's what you should be reporting. So it's easy to write on the paper, but the most important thing to do before you even start the study. And when you're planning your study, I would strongly urge you to look at certain guidelines, such as the consort guidelines, which tell you what are the questions you will have to answer when you're reporting the study. So for example, when you start writing a randomized control trial and you want to publish it, the journal will immediately say report according to the consort guidelines. And the consort guidelines tells you, I want answers to the following 10 questions in the paper. Now, if you haven't gathered those 10 answers, you can't write them. Therefore, you should have looked at those consort guidelines even when you were planning your study. It's like knowing the question paper to your exam even before taking the exam. If submitting the paper to a reviewer is the exam, the question paper is the consort guidelines. If you read it while preparing for the exam, while writing your thesis protocol, you would know that the reviewer is going to ask me these 10 questions. I might as well design my study to gather those 10 answers. Therefore, look at those guidelines even before you start your study. And the example that I told you about validity. Can your study actually answer the questions you're raising? So if you're raising questions about complications in 30 days, and if you have not even spoken to the patient after day 2, your study cannot answer the question. Your methodology should be written in extreme details. It's called the PICO question, the patient intervention, comparator, and outcome if you're doing a comparative study. So who was studied? How was it studied? What were the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What was measured? How was it measured? When you say we assessed efficacy of holmium versus TURP, what do you mean by efficacy? Efficacy to you may mean IPSS, to somebody else it may mean Qmax, to a third person it may mean cost, to a fourth person it may mean degree of hospitalization. So random words like efficacy don't mean anything to me. You have to give me an endpoint and define how you will measure the endpoint. You will say we assessed efficacy in terms of flow rates after 10 days. Perfect. Now you have a measurable endpoint. Now tell me how you measured it and what were the results. So it may not always be as objective as a flow rate. You may be using questionnaires, you may be using subjective assessment, but there has to be an endpoint and there has to be a tool to measure that endpoint. And that must be given in your method section. And then, of course, your statistics. And don't say appropriate statistics were used. There is nothing appropriate about appropriate statistics. Tell us very specifically what statistics were used for what kind of variable or what kind of comparison. Non-parametric tests, parametric tests, ANOVAs or non-ANOVAs. Did you use chi-squares for dichotomous variables? So be as specific as possible as to what kind of tests were used for what kind of variables. So tips for writing it: again, write it first. It's already written when you're writing a paper. It should have been written when you wrote the protocol. It's always written in the past tense. Everything you know before you start the study is methods. So that's why I said you've written it even before you started the study. So whatever you know you're going to do is methods, and therefore you know it even before you started the study. Always check for the PICO if you're doing a comparative study. And whatever you write in the methods for the endpoints, they must be consistent. Don't write in future tense that we will do. Now, this is the difference between writing a protocol and writing a paper. When you're writing a protocol and submitting it for ethics approval, it will be in the future tense. You will say, we will gather patients, we will do this test, we will assess them like this. But when you're submitting it for a paper, you've already done it. So make sure you change it back into the past tense. Now let's talk a little bit about the results. So the results section only talks about what you found. So this is information that you did not know when you started, and it's only information you've gathered from the conduct of the study. How you write the results is important. What results should you write? All the essential results about the demographics or to define your population must be given. Next, you must give answers to all the endpoints that you said you will answer in your methodology section. So if you're a methodology, you said, I will gather efficacy data on the following 6 points: blood loss, transfusion rates, complication rates, whatever. You said I'm going to measure 6 things. Make sure you give the results on all 6 things. If you found something else, you can give that as well. But at least all that which you gathered information for must be given. Therefore, all the endpoints that you listed in your methods must be answered. If you're putting in tables, make sure they're consistent. If your table says the average age was 63, your text should not say 61 and your abstract should not say 60. This often happens because you're revising it. Sometimes you look at data, you reanalyze data and you make changes, and you make it only at one place and you don't make it at another place. That shows sloppiness and you are likely to get into trouble. Whenever you write the results, there are 3 ways in which you write the results. One is the text, the second is the tables, the third is the figures. And typically we call it the story is the text. So the summary, the most important point, we found the complication rate to be 30% and vascular complications were the most common at 18%. That's the text, that's the meat, that's the story. The meat is complications A, B, C, D, E, cleaved into 1, 2, 3, 3A, 3B, 4, 4%, 8%, 6%. So all that goes into the table. The summary take home point comes into the text. Figures are typically what we call drama, anything which has to be shown as an image. You want to show a horrid vascular complication of the aorta being divided, and you manage to take a picture of it, put that in the figure. So everything has its important role, but don't overlap the content. Don't duplicate information between the text and the tables. Don't give any information in the tables that you haven't described. If you weren't gathering data on cost, let's say you want to, you didn't describe how costs were assessed, but in your table you've got $200 here and $600 there. Now the next question is, how did you get this data? You didn't describe this in your methodology. Then about the p-values and confidence intervals, please give exact p-values, not less than or greater than, and also give confidence intervals. This is a little more of statistics. I'm not going to go into it right now because that's not our mandate, but give confidence intervals wherever you have them available. Tables and figures, like I said, don't overlap. Don't give the same information in pie charts. So for age, you give me one pie chart of 50 and 60. You also put it in table, which is 50 and 60. And in the text, you say 50% were males. Redundant. We don't need it at 3 places. One is enough. Then we come to the discussion section. In the discussion section, remember, this is not a literature review. You are not going to quote 5 studies. We found complication rate to be 13%, X found 8%, Y found 18%, Z found 4%, Z so and so found 6%. Next point, we found transfusion rate to be 4%. They found this percent, they found that percent, this found this. That is not a discussion. The discussion is we found the complication rate to be 18%. All right, what does it mean? Now, this is different from this study, and we feel it's different because they were all consultants and we were all residents. We believe it is different because we operated much more on tuberculosis patients, whereas they operate typically on PUJ patients. We believe that complications were higher because we don't use harmonic dissectors, whereas they use hormone. Whatever be it, what is the value of the information that you're providing, and how does that relate to other publications? Is what comes in the discussions. You of course have to quote other people's studies. You have to give a comparison with what others have done, because that's what puts your data into perspective. But it's not just so many citations of so many people who have done it. Explain what you mean and what does it mean in terms of the current knowledge, and of course list your limitations. So when you're summarizing, a good way of writing the discussion is the first paragraph can actually be a summary of your most important findings. And then in the next few paragraphs, address each endpoint. You talked about your endpoint being complications. All right, we found this. What does it mean? We found blood loss to be this. What does it mean? We found readmission rate to be this. What does it mean? And then finally, you must write what are the most important limitations. Don't say we are limited by the fact that we were a retrospective study. Well, that was a study design. That's not a limitation. The limitation could be that we couldn't gather enough data, or we couldn't find the files, or we couldn't get the patients to come back. That's a limitation. But simply saying that this is a retrospective study and that's a limitation of our study is not a limitation. That's your study design. So limitations are what genuinely limit from your data from being useful. The conclusion section should be based only on your results. It should only address the points that you raised and shouldn't go beyond that. The conclusions can often be just 2 sentences long. Make sure that you talk only about what you found and not about what you believe it means. And we found complication rates were 10% and we believe this was the best in the world, or we believe that now laparoscopic nephrectomy should become standard of care. Stop. Just say we found it to be 10%, we found it decreases over time, and we found it comparable with everybody else. That's enough. Don't extrapolate it to saying that therefore now we believe it's a cost-effective method, therefore now we believe it should become standard of care. That's not a conclusion. The next few slides I'm going to go over relatively quickly. They are quite a few slides, but I'm just going to go over the most important ones. References, we tend to skip over them, but please make sure you do your references properly. If you're quoting a reference saying that this reference, so and so said, laparoscopy is not good, and you give a reference, make sure that that is what he said. Read that paper completely, and if that is what he said, you quote that reference. Otherwise, you quote a reference to claim something, but that reference doesn't actually say it, the reviewers aren't going to like you, because it means that you haven't actually read the paper and you're just putting in a number to impress. Read the paper, make sure the references are correct, make sure the references are written in the right style. And if you have a recent reference, use a recent reference. Don't pick up a reference from 1950. If there is a reference from 2010 that talks about the same thing. And please don't be biased. Just because you've done a study that found 10%, that means don't quote everybody else who was greater than 10 to say you're the best. There may be others who are 5 and 6 also. So be unbiased. When you talk about the submission, many of us make the mistake of saying, let me first send the first paper. I'll change it once I get comments from the reviewers and make it better. Now that's a bad policy. Your first submission should be the one that you've spent the maximum amount of time on to make it as perfect as possible. Read the journal guidelines. Every journal has small quirks. Somebody wants you to write background, somebody writes purpose, somebody writes introduction. These are quirks, but follow them. Don't offend the editor. You are anyways going 90% likely to be rejected. Don't make your rejection rate likely to be 92% because you can't even follow the basic guidelines. And make sure you do a spell check or a grammar check. Very briefly about misconduct. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The most common misconduct that we will come across is plagiarism. Now, plagiarism is a huge chapter in itself. I'm only going to summarize it for you, that plagiarism basically means taking that which is not your own. So if you have taken a text, a figure, a diagram, a paragraph, a sentence from somebody else, that's plagiarism. You have to refer to other people's work. You have to cite them, but you have to write it in your own words. You have to read their article, understand it, Write what you understood from it in your own words and then give the reference number. You can't copy from there and paste it and then put a reference number. That's plagiarism. Reading it, understanding it, interpreting it, and then writing it in your own words is what you're required to do, and then putting a citation next to it. You can't even plagiarize your own work. So if you've published one article somewhere and you now think I want to publish it in another journal by adding 5 more cases or rewriting it in another journal, that also is plagiarism. So you can't even do that. There must be something new to say, written afresh for you to write a second article. The commonest place where plagiarism occurs is in the introduction and in the discussion section, because that's where you have to write your own words. Methods have already been written. The results are generally data. It's the introduction and the discussion which you find most difficult, but the only solution is to make an effort to write it. The other common misconduct issues are data manipulation. So you operated on 24 patients, the first 4 died, so you start counting from number 5 onwards. That is data manipulation. You're omitting the first 4 because you don't want to show that 4 people died. You shouldn't do that. Image manipulation, you've got a small residual stone after your PCNL. You change the contrast of the picture so that that residual stone is not visible. That's image manipulation. Fabrication, of course, is obvious. You don't have hemoglobin data for 4 out of your 50 patients. You just give an average of all 50 without telling us that it's actually only for 46. That's data fabrication. Using the word randomized without understanding what randomization is all about. Just because you said A gets this, B gets this, C gets this, D gets that, that's not randomization. There is a process to randomization, and you must follow randomization in the correct manner. The other misconduct, of course, is authorship misconduct, multiple submissions or submitting to multiple journals at the same time. Don't do it. And again, I'm not delving into misconduct because that's not the focus of this talk. Finally, why is all this a big deal? It's a big deal because everybody is now aware. There are data software available. There are lots of tools available to find misconduct. And if it is detected, it looks really bad on you. You will be contacted, your faculty would be contacted, your institution would be contacted. You may get a punishment for it. Your article would, of course, get withdrawn. And therefore, there are lots of punishments. And all of us are now aware of numerous examples in the past where stuff like plagiarism has had very major ramifications on people. And the most recent, of course, that which highlights the power of a paper is that which comes from these 2 articles, which unfortunately got retracted with huge backlash just a year ago, all related to fabricated or fake data on the COVID pandemic. So the summary, writing a paper requires effort. Just because you've done a thesis or a research doesn't make it into a paper. You need to plan a paper. The most important part, of course, is having something to say. There are very few people who can say something without having anything to say, and most of them are called politicians. Everybody else needs to have some material before they can say something. There must be a systematic approach to how you do it, and it's not difficult. It's very easy. Use those guidelines. They're available on a website called the equatornetwork.org. All those guidelines are available, whether you want to write a case report, a review article, a systematic review, a meta-analysis, a randomized trial. All guidelines are available. Use them. Avoid this Control-C, Control-V phenomena. It makes life very easy because you can just copy paste from a random source. Everything can be copied, and it's the biggest cause of plagiarism. And most important, be ready for revisions. 9 out of 10 you will need to revise, but be ready to get a paper back. Don't assume that these guys have got it in for me and they're simply not taking my paper because I'm writing from a small institution in a small country. There probably is a flaw in your paper. Be honest with your paper and then revise it and submit it. So thank you very much again for the opportunity and for listening, and of course to Peter for having sat through the whole thing and for giving us the time. Thank you, Shivam.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thanks for that very short and succinct, very clear deliberation on how to write a paper, which is actually a very complex and broad topic. So we would, before taking the questions and answers, I would request Peter Black to give his few comments, and then we would proceed to question and answers. Peter, you're most welcome to our platform.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I always learn a lot when I hear Raju speak about anything related to publishing. I think that was a great overview with so many important tidbits that for all the residents and trainees in the audience who are actually writing a paper, if you could have a recording of this talk and you listen to it before you start writing your paper, it would make a big difference. I think there are a lot of structural things about writing a paper that are just lost and not done. And if we all took a step back and planned it out based on clear instructions like what Dr. Kumar has provided, it would really raise the level of the paper right from the beginning. So yeah, I think there are a lot of really important points in there.
Thank you, Peter.
You're on mute, Shivam.
Shivam, you're mute, yeah. Shivam, you're still mute.
I'm really sorry. So before taking up the so we would take now the question and answers. There have been few questions in the chat box. So Rajiv, you said about the format of IMRED, and that is probably the format for the text, actual text. We have something to start with, like the topic, the abstract, and the keywords, everything when you write a paper. So there was a question on the topic, how to choose a topic. How to choose a topic, and can you just elaborate on for the residents, how should they choose a topic?
So I'll have two parts to this answer. The first is to a resident. Residents would rarely be in a position to define their own research topic today, the way things work in our country. Therefore, this question actually is to their teachers, to the faculty who help them choose a research topic and or often allot them a research topic. Choose a research topic that you can do in the time that is available to you. Choose a methodology that you think you can achieve within that period of time and with your resources. And then look for a question that you think needs to be answered. Now, that is the most difficult part. Is there any question that hasn't been answered that I need to answer? The best way to address that would be to pick up the last 3 months or 4 months of journals, the best journals that you can see around, and go through them. What are the points that are still not being addressed by the articles that are published there? That's one way of looking at a research question. The second is if you worked in the department, and this is where your faculty come in, and they have experienced certain questions in their day-to-day dealing with their patients that they haven't been able to answer. That's how you identify a research question. So either from the experience of your faculty and their day-to-day working, knowing that these are problem areas that we don't have answers to, that's one way of getting a research question. The second is to look at the most recent publications of the good journals, see what the research questions are being discussed there, and see if one of them is something that interests you. So that's what you would do for a long article or for a research original article. If you're talking about case reports are not something you plan. Case reports are just something that happen. You see something that is interesting, and then you'd say that this is something that I think needs to be written into a case report, and that becomes a case report. So you can't really plan a case report.
Thanks, Rajiv. Peter, would you like to add something on this?
Yeah, I think often, especially as a resident or fellow, if you're trying to think of a question, you're gonna want to do something that is related to something that your institution does a lot of. So if you're in an institution that is a major laparoscopic center, for example, in your region, then you've probably done more laparoscopic pyeloplasties, for example, than anybody else around. So you want to focus in on that, where you're going to have a good sample size, and there may be dozens or hundreds of publications on that topic, and so you have to find something different that you think has not been answered in the literature. You see, I'm always surprised when you go to the AUA every year and you see the same questions asked over and over and over again. And you think, didn't we answer that, 10 and 20 and 30 years ago? But if you can find a different aspect to it that has not been asked, the question may still be relevant. And ultimately, most questions have been asked in some way. So it is often just a matter of finding a different twist that gives us some insight into new details.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, that's what I thought, that probably because as a center, the most things that we are doing, so that should be actually part of your topic, maybe part of your topic. As in our center, if you are doing PCNL for last 40 years and have done more than 40,000 PCNLs, probably the largest center in the world. So we need to make more papers on that particular subject, which we are doing the most. So that could be one of the topics. And secondly, if you have in your mind something which is could be very innovative, which could be very problem solving, and you have come up with this, and then you can probably decide that particular topic. So yes, these are the two, I think, most important things. And what Rajiv said, yes, it's very important to know what then the other question that one of the residents have asked, that this particularly it deals with our part of the world where we have problem with the language. So what is the basically we lack in how to express ourselves in so that we can have a well-written paper. So how to overcome this problem? Because most of us think that the paper gets rejected because we have not been able to write it in a proper language or not able to express it properly. So Rajiv, please.
There are two parts to this, Shivam. The first is that unless the language is very, very poor that we can't even understand what it is, very rarely would a paper be rejected for language alone. If there is scientific content, the expression is not the best, that's okay. As long as we can understand what you're saying and what you're saying is useful information, it's likely to get accepted, and then the journal will work on making it better. On the other hand, if you've written it in a manner that you can't even convey the essential information, then there is a problem. And for that, the best solution is, of course, first your friends and your faculty. That's the first point where you seek help in writing it well. I want to avoid recommending commercial services, but commercial services are available which do provide you purely writing help without giving any input in terms of scientific content. You can use them, they are available, but I don't recommend them at all as the upfront need, because learning to write is a part of what we're trying to teach you as a resident. If you're going to outsource that, then that is not what we're teaching you. And therefore, although these services are available, and if you actually use them, you're required to declare that in your declaration to the editor that I have used a following service for writing my language, but I strongly discourage it. I would strongly encourage you to write it yourself, no matter how bad it is, as long as you can convey your information. If you've got 4 authors on your byline, make sure all 4 of them contribute by helping you towards the language, and then seek the help of a faculty to make it better. Finally, the journal will help you, as long as you can make us understand what it is that you wish to say.
So Rajiv, does the journal help in the language process? Peter, can you just come in this? If the author has not been able to express properly, but he has a good data and has done his work well otherwise, so would a journal help him to help in improving the language of the paper?
I think that it depends on the journal. So first of all, I just reiterate what Rajiv said. I think there are 3 components to the paper. There's the actual scientific content, which has to be good. The structure has to be logical and easy to follow. And then the language is really a detail, and we can fix the language if the first 2 components are correct. If the first 2 are a mess, then the language is often what stands out. And, a lot of reviewers comment on language. So it is important. I think, so for the SIU journal, for example, we have a managing editor who will rewrite sections that are not appropriate English. I was associate editor for the World Journal, also through the SIU when it was SIU's partner journal. And the publisher provided 0 support the paper was published as the authors submitted it without any revisions. So it does depend on the journal. Every now and then a paper goes back, I would say, with the specific request that, you know, the authors need to do something dramatic to improve the quality of the English. That somebody with, you know, whether it's a native speaker or somebody with very good English has to revise the paper. So we do that on occasion, and I often wonder what happens on the other end. Do they go to professional service? And it's interesting what Rajiv said. I've never seen anybody actually list in their paper that they've used a professional or commercial service to revise the paper, but you're right, it should actually be there.
Shivam, you got muted again.
So one of the residents has asked, can IJU or major journals review our abstract and detailed protocol before we can start the research work and reduce eventual rejection chances? I think he's he's at fault because abstract is usually written after you have done the work, total complete work. So what he means probably is, if you send the abstract and if you if you want that the whole article to be sent or not before rejecting it. So is it possible to send the abstract first and then the article?
So if you're asking me that, so there's an
yes, Rajiv, yes.
Somewhere. Okay. If you're sending me that you want to send me your protocol before starting the study, I would be happy to look at it as long as you send me your faculty salary also. So whatever you're paying your faculty as salary, if you send that to me as well, I'll be happy to look at your abstract, because that's what your salary, your faculty is supposed to do. If you're telling me that you want to send me only the abstract of the final manuscript to take a decision on, that won't work, because the abstract doesn't convey the entire content of your manuscript. So we can't decide on acceptance or rejection purely on the basis of an abstract. That will actually be doing you a disservice. We would rather read your full paper than just your abstract to take a decision.
So probably he has said because most of the papers that sometimes we get rejected. So how to reduce the rejection? Probably what he meant. Anyway, can you suggest? One of the question was how to select the journals, and so that the rejection chances would be least. Because is there any way, Rajiv?
So you can't select a journal purely on the basis of rejection. Well, you can actually. If you go to one of the predatory journals, there is zero rejection, 100% acceptance. So you can pay, publish, there is zero rejection. You go to NEJM, guaranteed rejection. So yes, you can choose on that basis, but to a large extent, it's very difficult to predict which journal will accept and which will reject. I have painfully aware of articles which we have rejected, which have actually got accepted in journals which are ranked higher than us. Therefore, simply saying that because the IJU has rejected you, that doesn't mean anything. You may actually get accepted by a journal which actually is ranked even higher than us. And that happens routinely. So you can't choose a journal to say that I will get accepted here, therefore I will go. But you must have an understanding of what is the value of your paper. That's an inherent assessment you or your faculty should make. That is this paper really worth sending to the Journal of Urology, or is it very unlikely to get accepted there? Is it really worth the NEJM? So the pecking order of the journals is not sacrosanct, but yes, there is a assumed pecking order of the journals. And that's where the experience of your faculty comes in to decide which is the best place to try first for this manuscript. Very difficult to give you a blanket idea. But one strong recommendation that I will make about choosing a journal is that unless you're only looking at PubMed indexation or impact factor because you require it for your promotion, I would rather choose to publish in a journal where my article is read than in an article which does have an impact factor which is higher than another article, but nobody reads it. So you publish it in article of X country, in journal of X country, because it has an impact factor of 1, but don't publish in your own journal which may not have that impact factor, but you believe that that has an impact factor, therefore I'll publish it. So you need to be a little bit judicious. If you're getting the Journal of Urology as a publication, certainly take it. It's both read and cited. But going to a journal just because it has one particular attribute but isn't read by anyone may not be the best approach.
So in that, do you mean that the open access journals would be the best to choose because they are read the most?
Now, interestingly, that is what everybody's perception is, that open access journals are read the most. That is also true for us in India, where we don't have institutional access to most journals. But across the world, it's been found that the citation index for open access journals is only 1.6x compared to non-open access journals. So, and again, that's the skewed data. I'm not going to get into that debate because that's also because most people who publish and cite are also the ones who have open access to all articles. Therefore, that's a skewed, confounded data. But open access doesn't mean bad. Let's be clear about that also. Paying to publish isn't bad. Many good journals will ask you to pay. BMJ will ask you to pay. PLOS will ask you to pay. Just because you're paying, that doesn't make the journal bad. It's because they guarantee you a publication if you pay, irrespective of the scientific quality, that makes them bad. So open access, yes, if either they don't charge you or you can afford the charges. Both are fine.
So when you raise this issue of charges for a paper, one of the question was because we live in developing country, so the charges usually for the international journals goes in thousands dollars, $600,000, etc. Particularly for the case report, if you want to publish, so it becomes a very huge amount of money when we think in our currency. So is there any way to waive off this amount for developing countries? So I would request Peter also to come in with his comments on how to choose a journal and waiving off the charges that some of these journals put.
Yeah, I think for selecting a journal, I don't think I have much to add to what Rajiv said. I think the very important point is that you're thinking of who's going to read the paper, and you want the paper to be in a journal that's going to target that audience. And of course, there are many urologic journals that hit mostly the same audience, and there's a spectrum of impact factor. And to some degree, it's a guess of where your paper fits and where you're going to try first, and then you go usually down, not up from there. But I also have stories. I remember handling a paper for urologic oncology, which is impact factor of about 4. And the paper was rejected and subsequently published in Journal of Clinical Oncology with an impact factor of about 16. So, sometimes it's completely unpredictable. The resident or fellow submitting the paper is the one who has to do all the reformatting work and resubmit it again and again and again if you aim too high. So often it's a matter of how much effort you want to put into the resubmission process. For processing fees, I think, as far as I know, there's not a lot of flexibility there. Most of the journals are, I think the ones we're talking about are, and Rajiv can correct me if I'm wrong, are in the US or Europe. And so they just have one global charge and that's it. And I agree that there are journals, for example, on the research side, cancer research, clinical cancer research are very well-known journals, and they will charge you by figure. So they're not just charging you a publication fee, but they're charging you for every figure that you include in your paper, which is basically doing the same thing. And it makes it seem a little bit more legitimate, or it is legitimate. But I think you really have to take a close look at a journal if you're in doubt to see is it a reputable journal, or is it actually one of these so-called predatory journals, so that you're not crossing that line. We at the SIU journal, we initially so it's open access, and we wanted to have a benefit for membership, which would be no publication fees. And if you weren't a member, you paid a publication fee that was equivalent to membership in your country. And of course, there's a fee structure that depends on where you are in the world. But we actually, in the end, completely waived that. So that was the only model I was aware of that adjusted for where you come from, but we actually got rid of that, and everything's free. So.
Thanks, Peter. And before I go to a very pertinent question, which has always been in my mind, I would request any other faculty member, Nachiket, Neeraj, and all other faculty members who are present here, if you have any question in mind, just please, you're most welcome. Nachiket,
sir.
yes.
Good evening. Good evening. Wonderful talk as usual again from Rajiv sir, and thank you, Peter, for coming in the department program. Like Rajiv said that, the important thing when you're deciding upon a study, to give to your resident is take journals and look what has been published 3 or 4 months back, and then decide with the resident whether, you want to do that kind of a study. I remember we used to do the same thing, and there was an era in 2017, 2018, I remember, when we used to go into the Journal of Urology and other urology, there was a war on partial prostatectomy for CA prostate. It started with an article from France, and then a group from Los Angeles published, partial prostatectomy robotic for CA prostate, and then a group from Miami published, and the whole year and the whole journal for 2 years was just full of partial prostatectomy, robotic partial prostatectomy for CA prostate. So in the context of a country like ours, in which 99 of urologists do not have access to a robot. So what do you think about, publications, of that sort, which basically, I would, as a consultant myself and as a teacher myself, be defeated, because I know I would not be able to, get that kind of a thing started. So first to Rajiv, if you remember that time in 2017-18, it was discussed at length also in said meetings that I think that the journals, they are just discussing robotic partial prostatectomy for CA prostate. So, I mean, it is still a pleasure to read the Indian Journal of Urology, which makes sense to, consultants like me and teachers like me. So, but what do you have to say about that? This is because, these days we feel dissociated from, journals that we talk about, for example, like NEGM, even, the Journal of Urology, and maybe the boss journal, BJU. So I would like your comments on that, and what can we do? This, because sometimes you get, you think whether you should at all be trying to send even your good articles to these journals. So just running comment from you as well as Peter.
Nachiket, when it comes to choosing a research topic, the onus is 100% on the faculty. And again, Peter, this may be different in the US, where you have probably fellows coming up with their own research topic. We get fresh graduates who have done surgery and who have very little experience of urology, and they need to pick a topic for research in the first 3 months. I lay the blame squarely on the faculty if the research design is poor or the research topic is poor. This is precisely the responsibility of faculty to decide what should be done, what can be done. Now you are talking about can. Somebody claiming to do a robotic partial prostatectomy study in India would have to be out of his mind. There are none that are done. The number of robotic prostatectomies per se being done in any institution are so small to be able to do a decent study on a prospective manner. Well, now there are some institutions which do enough to be able to do a prospective study, but in general, there are very few. That reading the journal and saying that I'm going to be able to copy this and I want the same thing done by my resident is foolhardy. You read the journals to get an idea of what are the areas of research or areas that have unanswered questions. That's where your knowledge as faculty or experience of 20 years as faculty comes in to decide, is this worthwhile in India? Can it be done in India? Can it be done in the 2 years that my student has to do his MCH thesis? Will he get enough cases? Will he get enough money? That's the faculty's job. And that's the job of the teachers. And I find no one else to blame but the faculty when it comes to designing a study poorly. If they conduct it poorly, that's the resident's job. But if it's been planned poorly, that's the faculty's job. And it's your job to decide what you can do or should do in your own area. The question about publishing in a big name journal, again, very difficult to answer that question, Nachiket. All of us carry a chip on our shoulder, believing that we are discriminated against, but that's not true. I don't ascribe to that principle at all. Uh, all of us have biases. Editors have an inherent bias, or human beings have an inherent bias. What you're looking for is trustworthy, good research. So that doesn't depend upon where you are from. It depends more upon what do I know about the institution, what do I know about the individuals, and how trustworthy. Like I said, nobody cross questions. If if an obscure institution sends me an article of a randomized trial of 30 of 200 lower pole solitary renal calculi randomized for RIRS versus 200 solitary lower pole renal calculi for PCNL in 1 year, and I've seen these papers, I will really need to wonder, do they really have the ability to randomize 400 such subjects in 1 year? So that's why you get a feeling of a bias, but it isn't really that bad.
There is another question about, I mean, what level of ethics permission do you think would be required? This because that is sometimes it becomes a deterrent, especially inside observational papers in which you know have been observing for a long time and you want to write down maybe an observational study, and this has happened a few times also maybe inside our department, and you cannot get retrospective ethics approval, and maybe also rightly so also journals, I mean abroad also, they would not publish your study. This is because, say, your observation goes 5 years back, 7 years back, and it's difficult getting at that time, as we know, ethics approval. Maybe it was not that stringent, maybe 7 years back, 8 years back. So what do we do inside that condition?
Okay, so two parts to your question. I will answer them both. Number one, ethics committee approval is required for virtually every study that involves human subjects. Now that's the bottom line. Virtually every study that involves a human subject requires ethics committee approval. When you talk about pulling out case sheets and doing an observational study, you don't need to go back and take an ethics committee approval. This is a retrospective study. You now need to take ethics committee approval for conducting a retrospective study. That approval you take today. The question you're asking is for having recorded the data. I never took approval 7 years ago when I started maintaining a database, and now I have a database. So ideally, yes, you should have taken approval of or of an ethics committee to maintain a database. But it's also a fact that patients coming to a hospital give both an implied and a written consent for their data to be stored in the retrieval systems of the hospitals for future use. Uh, and therefore, that specific, if it wasn't a study, if all you've got are case sheets and you're pulling out case sheets, you didn't actually record data in a specific pro forma in a prospective database. If all you're doing is pulling out case sheets, you don't need to go back and take approval. You need to take approval today. You go to your ethics committee today. I want to look at my retrospective data for 7 years. I will be pulling out case sheets for looking at this data. Please give me approval today. Therefore, getting an ethics committee approval for retrospective studies is relatively easy and straightforward. Where you get stuck is when you conduct prospective studies, where you conduct trials, where you conduct interventional studies and you don't take ethics committee approval prior to starting them. Then you get stuck, because then your ethics committee approval, taking it for retrospective, will not work. I saw a question on the chat box. Is ethics committee approval required for 2% jelly versus 2% injection before PCN? 100% you require an ethics committee approval. This is a prospective interventional study. There can be no higher level of study which requires an ethics committee approval. So there is no doubt you require an ethics committee approval for every single interventional prospective study. And even for retrospective studies, you do require an ethics committee approval, although many journals will waive that requirement today as an interim before it becomes mandatory.
Thanks, Rajiv. Often this ethics committee approval, because yes, in some centers you have to pass through a screening committee first, and then you have to pass through a ethics committee approval. Usually it may take maybe weeks or months before the things get approved. So it depends upon the institution and the ethics committee, how encouraging they are. And that could be a deterrent for doing studies also for our young residents also. So the last question that I was wanting to put is we all know that, and in your talk also you said, paper writing has the main impetus now. It can be a money factor. It could be to announce your existence, as you said, and for promotion. I feel that mostly almost 90% is probably for these reasons and not for actual development of urology throughout the world or making something new out of your paper. So what has been troubling me
Shivam,
I kind of lost the.
yeah, actually, I think Shivam sir has some network issues, sir. That's why.
Okay, I thought it was my network which was a problem,
No,
but
sir, even we
I
cannot
couldn't
hear.
hear.
Sir, I am Dr. Neeraj Agarwal. I am faculty in the department, and I have a very basic question. And as a consultant or a teacher, every year, it's a very daunting task for me to allot a topic to a particular candidate. And considering the number of candidates who are increasing day by day, like we have almost 30 residents in our department, so it's a humongous task to allot a different topic to every resident every year. Add to it, there are constraints in our department, especially in a government run setup where you have limited resources, you have limited infrastructure, you don't have access to all those instruments or gadgets that you want the study to be worked upon. So how do you resolve these issues, especially working in a government setup with limited infrastructure and at the same time allotting different topics every year to residents? So I think this situation exists almost in every setup.
Yeah, you're very right, Neeraj. The question you raise is very important and very pertinent. And unfortunately, I don't have any simple answers for it. Peter, you'll find this very strange because this is something very specific to how we work in an institution where we often get more residents than we can handle. So the answer to your question would be more from experience. Why do we give a research topic to a resident? Are we really expecting them to bring out a Journal of Urology paper? The fact is, we aren't. We give them a research topic primarily because we want them to learn how to do research and learn how to do critical analysis. That's a basic objective. We would love to get a good paper out of it. That's why we put our hard work into it. But we also realize that it's not always possible. I would suggest you look at simpler things that you can do with the data that you have already existing, or do an analysis of a local question that you can answer or a local problem that you can answer over the next year and a half. It's very difficult to give you absolute answer, exact answers of how you can solve your problem. The problem you highlight is available through everywhere. Every place people are burdened with more residents that they can handle. I can't give you a better answer than that.
I would add that we have fewer residents, and perhaps we have more means. I don't know exactly, but we still have the same problem. It's you have to be creative. I mean, I think it's a good problem to have, right? You have young residents who are keen to do research, and you want to find a good project that will lead to a paper and productivity, and that it's a very rewarding experience for the trainee. But it can be difficult, it can be difficult to come up with that good question for which you have the appropriate data set or patient cohort or whatever. So yeah, it's challenging.
Shivam, we'd lost your question. If you want to ask that again, you're mute again.
I am really sorry. There was some problem with the link. So what I was asking was that what we have understood now, because we make our level of evidence based on the literature that we have. And the studies have shown that the literature and the studies that are done, more than half of them are not true. There are a lot of biases in it. There is a lot of kind of fake data based on which the studies have been done. And this, I would just quote two of the editor-in-chiefs of the two most prestigious journals, New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet. So this is Richard Horton, who said that editors and scientists portray peer review as a quasi-sacred process that helps to make science our most objective truth teller. But we know that the system of a peer review is biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, easily fixed, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish, and frequently wrong. This is what the editor-in-chief of New England Journal of Medicine, Richard Horton, had to say. Similarly, another editor-in-chief, Marcia Angel, said, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor." So what do you think the total evidence that we are now getting and the guidelines that we are based on these evidence, if that is not truthful, then how do we actually make these guidelines and how do we treat our patients? Is it something which is totally, we are doing something which is totally wrong? Or so I would just request your comment, Rajiv, and both Peters.
I'll let Peter go first. It's a difficult question. Let him answer first.
Please.
I would say your 2 quotes there are particularly negative way of looking at it. I think the process clearly is imperfect, and even in the highest level journals, some poor science will get through. I think to say that half of papers have incorrect information, I think often, for example, statistics are done poorly, and so the conclusions maybe are inaccurate, but the data is the data. The data is real. So I think we always in daily practice as surgeons, we always have to make decisions with the best available data. And specifically for surgical questions, we often don't really know. We don't have prospective randomized data on all the different things we're doing every day. And most questions in the literature have been asked multiple times by different groups. And so you look at the preponderance of evidence and how it aligns with your own experience, and you implement it. And I think ultimately the value of what's in the literature is not as poor as suggested by those 2 editorial comments.
So Richard Horton has written a lot of things, and he has this penchant for doing it. I agree with him to some extent. I think he is the one who said that if you exchange my inbox with my outbox, I wouldn't know which one is which. But then he can say that because you're sitting at a level which is always anyway so high, that saying that my rejections are as good as my acceptance for a New England Journal of Medicine is quite okay. It's quite understandable. For them to have reached his table would mean that they have already reached a certain level to be able to say that whatever where my acceptance are equal to my rejections. So I agree with Peter that looking at everything with such pessimistic or negative approach can't help us. Perfection has always been the biggest enemy of good. We are not perfect, but therefore we accept whatever is good and we work with that. Yes, you're mute again, Shivam.
What I meant was that we now know that most of our studies, if they are not based on correct data, what we are trying to base or I'm trying to form these guidelines on would be totally incorrect. So, and to add to this, we know also that most of our studies are pharma driven or technology, those company driven studies. So that makes it even more complex. So again, I think we cannot, at present, we cannot keep this level of evidence as something sacrosanct, and we have to think about our clinical experience also along with the level of evidence. What I was asking you that how to improve upon this level of evidence so that we can improve our make this level of evidence more truthful rather than incorrect. Yes. Is there any way to make it? I'm not being pessimistic at all. I'm trying to be to how to improve this situation.
Do good studies. That's the only solution. Do good research. Honest, good research.
Peter, any comments on that? Peter, any comments?
I think we can only control the studies that we do. And as Rajiv says, we have to, as individuals or working in our groups, we have to strive for good quality research. I think for Rajiv as an editor of a journal or myself, maybe you can implement things within your own journal to try and raise the level. But ultimately for each one of us on the call, it's all about doing good research ourselves.
Okay. Thank you. With that note, let me thank again both Rajiv Kumar for giving that wonderful talk on the basics of how to write a paper, and Peter Black, you have really spared your valuable time to come up with us on this platform of our teaching session of Department of Urology, SMS Medical College. Thanks again. Thank you very much and have a good day. And in this troubled time, I would all request all of you to remain safe and take care of yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shivam. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.